All right, let's dive into something pretty intense today. Schizophrenia and object relations theory.
Hmm.
We're going to try to unpack how our early relationships, especially those with our primary caregivers, like impact our mental well-being really throughout our lives.
Yeah, it's really interesting how these early interactions can shape, how we see ourselves and the world around us.
Totally. And our sources get into this, intense concept, the infantile psychotic self. It sounds kind of ominous, right? So, how should we be thinking about this, especially with someone who might be predisposed to schizophrenia?
Yeah, so it's not as, I guess, scary as it sounds. You can think of it more as like a potential vulnerability, present from infancy. Not necessarily a guarantee of psychosis or anything. It's important to keep in mind that schizophrenia, it's really this complex interaction, like biology and experiences, kind of all mixed together. It's not like a set outcome. You know what I mean?
Right. So it's like you might be predisposed to something, but it doesn't mean you'll necessarily develop it.
Exactly. Yeah. It's more like this vulnerability kind of interacts with certain environmental factors, especially those early relationships with caregivers. And that kind of determines where things go.
So those relationships can either help or hurt that inherent vulnerability in a way.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like, certain flawed ingredients, not the best way to put it, but in those early relationships, they can really contribute to a fragile, maybe even volatile inner world.
Do you have any specific examples of those flawed ingredients?
Yeah, absolutely. So imagine a child, right? And their mother has borderline personality disorder or even, is psychotic. That inconsistency, the kind of distorted reality the caregiver is presenting, well, it can really impact a child's, their sense of self, how they relate to others, all of that.
It's like trying to build a house on a shaky foundation.
Exactly. Yeah. And then you have this idea of interference with transitional objects.
Okay, transitional objects. What are those? How does someone interfere with that?
Okay, so think of like a child's teddy bear. It's more than just a toy, right? It's like this bridge between their inner world and the outside world reality. A kid might use it for comfort or to, self-soothe, or even just to navigate that shift from being alone to being with other people.
So if, say, a mother keeps taking the teddy bear away, it disrupts that process of the child moving between those two worlds.
Exactly. And that can really make the child feel insecure and create this sense of, instability in how they understand relationships.
Wow.
And, speaking of instability, another one of those flawed ingredients is being a replacement child,
Okay.
especially if, they were born soon after a sibling died.
Oh, wow. That's got to be really hard. How does that impact their development?
Well, imagine growing up constantly like in the shadow of this sibling who's passed away. Maybe they're always being compared to them, or they feel like they're responsible for their parents' grief on top of everything else. That can really distort their sense of self and lead to this deep-seated fear of abandonment. It's a lot.
And then, if a child experiences a major trauma early in life, on top of all of this,
It's like adding fuel to the fire, really.
Yeah.
Early trauma, it's incredibly destabilizing for anyone, but especially a child who's already dealing with a fragile sense of self. It can actually, and this is intense, but it can lead to this actualization of their unconscious fantasies. So those fears, those anxieties, they start to feel terrifyingly real. The story about Ricky from one of our sources, it really shews this in a really sad way.
Yes. The example of Ricky getting those gold rings every year, even though he has a deformed hand, it's it shows how a parent's own issues, their own stuff, gets all wrapped up in their child's development. It's almost like that need to maintain this image of perfection, it prevented his mother from really accepting his experience.
It's a classic example of how narcissism in a parent can really mess with a child's reality testing. They're left questioning themselves, their perception of everything. It's really hard to build a solid sense of self in that kind of environment.
So we've got this potential vulnerability, the infantile psychotic self, and then all these flawed ingredients that can make things worse. But does everyone with this predisposition and these tough early experiences, do they all develop schizophrenia?
No, not at all. A lot of times, this infantile psychotic self, it can be encapsulated by a healthier, a more functional sense of self.
So it's like they build this protective shell around that vulnerability.
Exactly. And that allows for, relatively normal development, at least for a while. It's like this period of stability. The person can function pretty well. They can have relationships, deal with the world, and that underlying vulnerability doesn't take over.
But from what I'm gathering from our sources, this stability, it's not always permanent.
That's right, unfortunately. as these individuals go through adolescence, adulthood, the challenges of life, certain stressors can trigger what we call organismic panic.
Organismic panic. Okay, now we're getting to the really interesting stuff. And by interesting, I mean potentially intense. So what does that even look like? How does it, relate to schizophrenia developing?
Imagine this. Okay. That protective barrier around the infantile psychotic self, it just crumbles. And all those raw emotions, all those perceptions, they come flooding in. The person is hit with all these terrifying thoughts, feelings, sensations, and they can't organize it. They can't make sense of it.
That sounds incredibly overwhelming, like being thrown into this chaotic and terrifying world without a map or anything. How do people even cope with that?
It's really, really difficult. This is usually when we see the donut personality emerge.
Okay, I have to admit, donut personality is not what I was expecting. Can you explain that a little more?
Sure. So picture a donut, right? The empty hole in the middle, that's the fragile, fragmented sense of self. That's the infantile, psychotic self that's now exposed and vulnerable. Now, the outer layer of the donut, the doughy part, that represents how the person tries to compensate for that inner emptiness.
So it's like they're trying to rebuild that shell, but it's hollow at its core.
Yeah, exactly. And this outer layer, it can be really up and down. One minute they might feel completely empty and worthless, and the next they feel grandiose, powerful, like they have special abilities or something.
So they're swinging between extremes, self-loathing, grandiosity, but all the while there's this like deep sense of emptiness inside.
Exactly. It can be really disorienting, both for the person going through it and for everyone around them. Their behavior, what they believe, it can be really unpredictable, even contradictory.
It sounds like this donut personality, it's a way of trying to manage all that anxiety and fragmentation that comes with that protective shell breaking down. Like a defense mechanism, but a really precarious one.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's trying to create some sense of order, some stability, when everything feels chaotic inside.
This has given us a lot to think about, especially how important those early experiences are, how they set the stage for mental health challenges later. But what about treatment? Is there hope for people dealing with this donut personality? I'm especially curious about therapy and how it might help someone reclaim a more whole sense of self.
That's the big question, right? And thankfully, there is hope. It can be incredibly challenging, but treatment, especially certain kinds of psychoanalysis, it can be really transformative for people.
Yeah, it's important to acknowledge that, psychoanalysis, it's not for everyone, and especially with something as complex as schizophrenia. But for some people, it can be this path to healing and really becoming whole.
Absolutely. And it's not a quick fix. It's a process for sure. But it gives you this really deep understanding and a way of working with, the unconscious. And that can be, it can be really powerful.
So how does it even work? What's the goal when you're working with someone who has schizophrenia, especially when we're talking about this donut personality, that underlying vulnerability of the infantile psychotic self?
Well, the ultimate goal is to help the person achieve what we call separation individuation.
Okay, say more about that.
So it's like, imagine they have to rebuild their sense of self piece by piece, and at the same time learn how to differentiate themselves from other people, but in a healthy way.
So building those boundaries between self and other, those boundaries that might have been blurry or broken in those early years.
Exactly. They need to develop a better sense of who they are, independent of their parents, caregivers, the people around them. And that means getting better at managing relationships, regulating their emotions, just being able to be in the world in a way that doesn't feel so threatening, so fragmented.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
How does a therapist even begin to approach that in the therapy room?
It's really this delicate dance. Honestly, the therapist has to learn to navigate these, they're intense, fusing, disconnecting, and externalization cycles that are just all over the patient's experience.
Okay, it sounds super complex. Can you give an example? Break those down a bit more.
Of course. Okay, so imagine a patient who's constantly kind of merging their identity with yours, with the therapist, or even someone else in their life. They might start acting like you, taking on your beliefs, even your identity, and it gets really blurry who they are, who you are.
So this desperate need to connect, to feel whole. And they're trying to do that by merging with another person. But then...
And the fear kicks in, right? They pull away, terrified of being overwhelmed or losing themselves in that connection. That's the disconnecting part of the cycle. They might suddenly feel completely alone, totally alienated, so they retreat back into themselves.
And it's this constant back and forth, this push and pull between wanting to connect and being terrified of it, that creates this like chaotic experience for them.
You got it. And the therapist, they have to be the steady, solid presence throughout all of that. They can't get caught up in the patient's fear or that need to merge. It's more about gently guiding the patient toward a way of relating that's, well, healthier, one where they can connect but also be their own person.
It's like walking a tightrope, right?
Yeah.
You need to be empathetic but also firm, present but not intrusive.
Yeah, you have to be really skilled, really sensitive, and sometimes the therapist even becomes part of those internal cycles. It's a way of understanding the patient and guiding them, but really gently. Remember the story about Ricky drinking the Turkish wine?
Oh, yeah. That one really stuck with me. It shows how important the therapist's presence is, how just by understanding they become a part of the patient's inner world.
Exactly. And in that story, the therapist isn't literally drinking wine with Ricky, right? It's symbolic. It's a way for Ricky to process, to internalize this experience of being cared for, of someone getting him. The therapist becomes this like container for his emotions, his experiences, a safe space to work through it all.
So the therapist isn't there to like fulfill all of Ricky's needs or merge with him completely. It's more about providing a secure base, starting point from which he can explore his inner world and start to build a more integrated self.
Exactly. And it really shows how powerful that therapeutic relationship can be. It's like a microcosm of those early object relations. It's a chance to like go back and maybe repair some of the damage that was done.
Which brings us to this other really important piece of all of this, transference and countertransference. I can only imagine how intense those dynamics must be when you're working with someone who's dealing with schizophrenia, especially with that fusing disconnecting pattern we talked about.
You're right. They're huge GE in this work. The therapist has to be so aware of their own emotional reactions to the patient, because those reactions, they can actually tell us a lot about the patient's inner world.
So the therapist's ability to recognize and actually USE their own countertransference is essential. Can you give an example of how that might look in therapy?
Sure. Take the case of Lillian, for example. She developed a really, really intense eroticized transference toward her therapist, who was male.
Wow. That must have been incredibly challenging for both of them. How did he handle that?
It was really intense, yeah. But he had good supervision, and he was able to address it with a balance of like empathy, but also being very firm. He recognized that Lillian needed connection, reassurance, and that this intense transference was coming from her past, her longing for that secure attachment that she probably didn't have. But he also set really clear boundaries, reminding her that their relationship, it was about therapy, about understanding her past, not about, recreating those early longings in the present.
So he was able to hold her experience, Lillian's experience, but also hold the boundaries of therapy at the same time. That couldn't have been easy.
It takes a lot of skill and self-awareness. The therapist has to realize that her feelings, while they're completely real and intense for her, they're not actually a literal request for a romantic relationship. Instead, they're these really important clues about her inner world, what she's missing, that longing for a secure attachment that probably wasn't there when she was young.
It shows how vital it is for therapists who work with people who have schizophrenia to have their own support system, their own supervision. This work is demanding, emotionally, intellectually, all of it.
You can say that again. The therapist needs a place to process their own stuff, to figure out what's going on in those complex dynamics, and to make sure they're responding in a way that's actually helpful to the patient, not just meeting their own needs.
So far we've been talking a lot about the internal world, those early object relations, how complicated the therapy process is. But we can't ignore how much culture impacts how we see and experience schizophrenia.
Oh, absolutely. The underlying mechanisms of schizophrenia, they might be universal, but how it shows up, how we interpret it, it's all connected to cultural beliefs and practices. It's fascinating, really.
So how does culture actually influence how schizophrenia manifests, how people make sense of it? It's like culture doesn't just shape how you experience schizophrenia, but also how people get help, how they even ask for it. It gives them a way to understand what's going on inside,
Exactly. You see, in some cultures, they might say schizophrenia is like spiritual. Maybe it's a curse or spirits are messing with you. Totally different from cultures where it's like a broken brain, a biological thing.
And those beliefs, they must make a huge difference in what kind of help people look for, right? It's not one size fits all.
Not at all. Someone who thinks it's spirits, they might go to a healer, do rituals, something like that. But someone who thinks it's biology, they'll want meds, therapy, the medical stuff.
It really shows how important it is to get where people are coming from, you know? Respect their beliefs, make it part of how you help them.
Couldn't agree more. If a therapist blows off what the patient believes, that's it. No trust, no healing. It's over.
There was this one study, it was in our sources, comparing what British and Chinese people thought caused schizophrenia and how to treat it.
Oh, yeah, that was a good one. Really showed how differently cultures see mental illness.
Right. The Chinese folks, they were more into religious reasons, superstitions, that sort of thing.
Right.
But the Brits, they were all about biology, psychology, social stuff.
And it wasn't just talk, it changed what treatments they wanted. Chinese, more open to herbs, acupuncture, things like that. British, give them the Western medicine.
So there's no one right answer, is there? Every culture has its own ways of knowing, ways of healing. Each one's got good points, bad points.
For sure. And those different views, they can be really helpful for the patient, Andy, the therapist, learning from each other, It helps us understand mental illness better and come up with ways to treat people that are, more well-rounded.
This has been quite the deep dive, huh? Early relationships, cultural stuff, all tangled up with schizophrenia. It's a lot.
It is, but we can't just give up trying to figure it out. The more we dig into this stuff, the more we question what we think we know, the closer we get to actually helping people.
So true. And as we wrap this up, I want to leave everyone with something to think about. It kind of brings everything together. If we understand someone's culture, their family, what it was like growing up, can that help us treat them better? Even if we're using object relations theory.
That's the million-dollar question. Makes you realize everyone's story is part of this bigger picture, right? Their culture, their family, it all matters. If we really want to help someone with schizophrenia, we got to see the whole person.
This has been a great conversation, really got me thinking, and I bet our listeners are going to be chewing on this for a while too. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, stay curious, everyone.